So let me introduce Dr. Sauber. Richard Sauber has been in practice for 30 years as a forensic, family, and clinical psychologist who specializes in the evaluation, consultation, and treatment of complex, litigious family cases. He's board certified in family and clinical psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology and licensed by some organization in Quebec around, what is it? Trained at Harvard University in the area of study, he has been court-appointed or retained as an expert conducting forensic evaluations in 14 states and also in Canada. Formerly, Dr. Sauber was professor of family and clinical psychology at the departments of psychiatry at the medical schools at Columbia, Brown, and the University of Pennsylvania. At the later two medical schools, he was director of their postdoctoral training program in family therapy. He's been on the founding board of directors of the Academy of Family Mediators and National Academy of Professional Custody Evaluators. He's also served on the advisory board of the Children's Rights Council in Washington, D.C. since 1976. Dr. Sauber has been the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Family Therapy. He's authored or edited 12 books, his most recent text being with Richard Gardner and Demosthenes Lorendos, entitled International Handbook of PAS, Conceptual, Clinical, and Legal Considerations. That was published in 2006. The second edition is being written by Demosthenes Lorendos, William Bennett, and Richard Sauber. That is entitled The Handbook of Parental Alienation for Mental Health and Legal Professionals, and it's due to be published in 2012. Dr. Sauber?
The first comment is that there will be one group that is offended by my presentation, and that is the preferred, favored, alienating parent. And that's somewhat intentional because they've taken it upon their right to offend the children and the targeted parent. So that's one group that I will not be sympathetic to today. Go ahead. Now, the title of the presentation is Alienation, Estrangement, and Bona Fide Abuse, the Differentiating Criteria for the Development of the Reunification Plan. And I'm going to focus today on moderate severe and severe cases, in contrast to some of the mild or moderate cases that have been presented and discussed today. First is that there is a myth of reunification therapy, and the recognition that a referral to a reunification therapist without a plan will be ineffective and fail. Courts see as a solution to any kind of high conflict family problems is make a referral to a mental health professional, call it individual, family, or reunification therapy, and expect the therapist to fix the problem. When there's no guidelines, no court sanctions, no assignment of authority, it just doesn't work. The structure makes the difference. But the courts often do not offer a structure, and thus failure results. Families that consist of high conflict and resistance, in which the targeted parent is desperate to try anything as the rejected parent, whereas in contrast, the alienating parent and the children that have been alienated give lip service to any kind of therapy or reunification attempts, and they prefer to avoid therapy altogether. So you have one willing partner, the targeted parent, and then the resistance of the alienating, rejecting parent, and the children following in the same format. What happens during these kinds of processes? The child says, "I don't know." The child stares at the floor. There's no trust. And essentially, it's very difficult to get any kind of valid treatment protocols to follow. What if you were asked to be the reunification therapist in a case that you saw and was clear an alienation matter of severity in which you believe that the only solution would be that the targeted parent and the alienated child would reside together in a reverse custody situation, and there'd be no contact with the alienating parent, and then supervised visitation. How would you convince anyone of what you think is the best? What do you do with that? And I see some heads nodding, because that's what we're faced with in a most frequent way. Well, let's talk about the history of reunification therapy, because history is being made at this time, and the history is quite scant. In fact, there's no experience other than trial and error and attempts at various reunification. The basic concepts initially was used of the term reconciliation, and then reintegration, and now reunification. And sometimes these concepts are interchanged, whereas reconciliation often deals with differences among the parties, and that may be considered more of a surface conflict in terms of a lack of destruction or fragmentation or rupture in the family system. Reintegration is often referred to when you have a recovered patient that may be schizophrenic or drug abused and returns to the family, and how they're reintegrated in the family in that kind of a role. And then we talk about reunification that includes concepts such as reunification therapy, reunification education, reunification evaluation, and reunification planning. The concept of reunification was introduced or constructed much like the term parental coordination in the mental health literature in a rather recent way. In fact, looking at the literature, I can trace it back to the year 2000, in which very few articles have been written about reunification. So there's no process or outcome research, only theoretical guidance by experienced forensic mental health professionals to offer some guidelines. When we have severe alienation cases, we're dealing with cases requiring planned reunification, often have years of litigation, high conflict within complex family dynamics, a succession of false allegations, refusal of child visitations, unilateral decision-making, interference with co-parenting, and a lack of disclosure to the non-residential parent as to the children's medical records and information about their social activities, friends, and school performance. Thus, reunification, whether it be therapy, education, or evaluation, is most difficult, and often moderate success is at best we can achieve. One reference to reunification refers back to the Berlin Wall in 1945, in which Germany had two states and then reunified in 1989. Eventually in 1990, cleared up most of the prior difficulties. So that's what we're dealing with in terms of reunification. And when we talk about reunification, I think we need some conceptual way to define success or whether it makes sense. One level would be families participating in which an obligation takes place. That is, there's a court order for the child to see the targeted parent in terms of shared parenting, and that takes place without interference and full resistance. So that might be considered success, even though there's no emotional expression or attachment between the targeted parent and that child, but at least the visitation does occur. A second, more favorable outcome might be in which there is shared time together with the targeted parent and the alienated child or children, in which there's some expression of emotion, perhaps laughter, and even having some fun, but yet when the child returns to the alienating parent, what happens? They forget about that experience and adopt to the environment in which they're living and residing on a more frequent basis, and that's with the rejecting parent. So no attachment takes place. And then the ideal solution that we all hope for is when the parent that's been previously alienated begins to enjoy, as well as the child, time together. There's emotional expression and a reattachment that existed prior to the either divorce or fragmentation that took place within the family, in which that child can say to the alienating parent, I had a wonderful time with their mother or their father, and look forward to seeing them again despite disapproval and contrary comments from the alienating parent. So that's the kind of genuine and natural expression that we would like. Now, what I would like to do is, when we talk about a solution and reunification, we have to be clear that we're talking about alienation and not confusing it with abuse or estrangement or other issues. So the differentiating criteria is critical before you deal with a situation which is already quite vicious and nasty, both in terms of the behavior that takes place by the alienating parent, the false allegations, the fabrications, and what occurs in court. And in this case, what I'd like to do is go through the criteria as defined by Richard Gardner in terms of his 8 symptoms for identifying PAS. And then what I like that he did was, in terms of abuse, he differentiated in terms of when there is a child abused, you typically see post-traumatic stress disorder symptomatology. And he identified 11 symptoms that you're likely to see in an abused child. And if you look at children that have been abused versus alienated, there are distinct differences, very different. The hallmark often considered in PAS is the attack on weakness or deficiency of the targeted parent, or fabricating such that when none exist, they're not justified, as opposed to the hallmark with PTSD, you see preoccupation with the trauma, unwanted thoughts, flashbacks, all these kinds of things, which from your training and experience, you're familiar with abuse. So I'm not going to spend an excessive amount of time, but just point out some of the differences so that you'll be prepared when people say it's abuse, it's not alienation, differentiating between these criteria. And then what I'm going to do is outline a more exhaustive account of estrangement, because it's real important that we don't mistake alienation for estrangement. And many of the cases I get involved with are probably considered severe alienation, in which I'm asked to do a forensic evaluation that could be called custody, PAS, reunification planning, or some other related title. And in about a third of those cases, I find that it's not a real case of alienation, maybe some mild or even moderate alienation has taken place, but there are other issues that account for the child's refusal to be with a parent. And I'm thinking about a case I had in which this was the targeted parent was from New Mexico, and he went to great lengths to find me and get me to be court appointed to do a custody evaluation. And when I found that there was no real alienation, his attorney then turned at me after writing an exhaustive report, tried to attack me, sent out my report to several other psychologists and another attorney, trying to refute my findings, and eventually the feedback was that the report made sense. The father wasn't forthcoming with me in a complete way. The daughter was expressing she was afraid to be with her father and go on a visitation, which was a plane ride and a week's or more visitation with the father. And the daughter claimed that during the evening, she was a young child of, I guess, 8 or 9. She was fearful of being left alone. And the father at night would go out food shopping. The daughter expressed, "Take me with you, wake me up, go some other time for food shopping. Please don't leave me alone." The father lied, at least to me, as well as his daughter, saying that he wasn't going food shopping at night. And it wasn't until I had in the room, in an evaluative capacity, the father and the daughter, and I said to the father, if you want to build a relationship with your daughter, you need to be open and honest with her to build some trust so that you can begin to have a visitation with her where she can feel comfortable. You're not going to do things that she's frightened of. And the father did admit that he did lie and that he would no longer leave the daughter alone. There were other examples of estrangement by the father who was insensitive to women, especially little girls who he had no experience with, growing up in a miner's town with all brothers, no sisters, and an ineffectual mother. The little girl was attached to her doll, and the father said, "You're a big girl now, you don't need this doll," and he put the doll outside the window, says, "I'm going to throw it out the window and discard it." And the child was frightened and screaming and pleading with the father not to do this. These are a few examples where it was presented as an alienation case when in fact it was estrangement, and this father needed a good deal of parent training to be effective with his children. So what I'd like to do is I'll go through briefly Dr. Gardner's classic symptoms and then talk about some of the symptoms of abuse. Then I'll go to estrangement and then put this together in a format to differentiate between traditional therapy, individual or family therapy, and reunification therapy. And here is a list that you're probably familiar with from Dr. Gardner's work of the 8 classic symptoms, in which he talks about the campaign of denigration and understanding that you get a command performance from the child, a quality of litany, the way in which they recite these problems that they've internalized as defined by the alienating parent. And the child often has what Dr. Gardner referred to as child amnesia, that prior to the divorce, they had a good relationship with the targeted parent, but cannot remember any of those positive experiences. Whereas in abuse with PTSD symptoms, there's a preoccupation with the trauma. They know specifically what occurrences that they were afraid of. They often have dreams that are reoccurring. So it's quite a difference between a statement a child may make that he's mean and he's stupid and I don't care if I ever see him again, versus a child that is able to identify specific flashbacks of abuse or trauma. Interestingly enough, abused children also crave the affection from the abuser and are quite upset about rejection, hoping for approval and affection despite past abuse experiences, where, as we know, alienated children don't think about the targeted parent and are not interested in approval or having any additional time with them. The second is weak and frivolous or absurd rationalizations. His children said that My father always gives me rotten food. And I brought out some food menus that the father gave me in which the children prepared menus and went shopping and prepared various meals for these children. And the children responded, well, that just happened once. They always have a way of rationalizing and minimizing these kinds of positive experiences. Lack of ambivalence. We know that all human relationships consist of ambivalence, and children are no exception. But the targeted parent is all bad, and the alienating parent is all good, and there's a lack of ambivalence. Whereas abused children are able to list positive experiences with the abuser that are different than the situation in which they were abused, but they can come up with positive statements, typically about the abuser. The independent thinker phenomenon is which the child denies that they've been programmed. They say, these are my thoughts, no one else's thoughts, whereas an abused child doesn't get into that whole scenario of defending their abuse. They just describe it as it is. Reflexive support for the alienating parent, and it's automatic that the rejecting parent is all wonderful and everything they say is true. There's an absence of guilt over cruelty to or exploitation of the alienated parent. That's kind of self-evident. Barred scenarios are often rehearsed, coached, and easily detected in the quality of the children's litanies or phraseologies. He hassles us or abuses us. One child I gave during an evaluation, a TAT kind of question, storytelling questionnaire, in which the picture showed a courtroom and the mother speaking to the judge about the father. And the question is, what did your mother say? And the child said, he abuses all of us. And I simply asked the child, well, what does that mean? And he shrugged his shoulders, not understanding the term abuse. The spread of animosity to others and extended family and friends, we know this typically takes place with a targeted parent with a remarriage or a significant partner, their parents, their friends. Everybody ends up being rejected, as opposed to an abused child does not reject the abuser's family and friends, and often has and maintains continuous good relationships with these people. Then if we look at the symptoms for PTSD, we see that they're quite different. Preoccupation with the trauma, as again one of the hallmarks of differentiating and diagnosing PTSD, the obsession and recurring thoughts of trauma, vivid recollections, where the PAS program child does not complain about any spontaneous eruption of memories into their conscious awareness. Episodic reliving and flashbacks. It's true with the abused child, but does not exist with the PAS child. There's disassociation, depersonalization, psychic numbing, derealization. The world is unreal and different, and none of these things exist with PAS. Recreational desensitization, fantasy play, is that maybe they're coping with the trauma with pretend games in which they assign certain parental roles, and this does not happen with PAS cases. In fact, often the fantasies are beyond the control of the programmer and are truly the child's themselves. Trauma-specific dreams, another hallmark of PTSD. These are nightmares, and content is often a replication of the abuse and is not identified or presented in PAS cases. Fear of people who resemble the alleged abuser, spread of fear to the non-abuser who resembles the abuser, often leads to panic attacks and startle reactions. Just not the same kind of hypervigilance that exists with an abused child versus with a PAS child. You just don't see these symptoms. Running away, typically an abused child may run away, but an alienated child won't run away unless it's part of the program and plan with the alienating parent, in which they say at a certain time, leave the house, say the targeted parent may have hit you or tried to, and we'll call 911, or the child will on their cell phone, which is quite different than an abused children. And abused children often feel pessimism about the future, where the alienated child feels that the targeted parent has no place in their future and they can live without the targeted parent, and are as optimistic as can be as long as they don't have to deal with the targeted parent. And then the differentiating criteria in parents. That was, the former comments were addressed toward children, but what we often see, there's relative cooperation in the evaluation that the targeted parent is very willing to spend money and open about anything and everything that will assist, whereas the alienating parent resists any kind of exposure and says the appointment times are inconvenient, they don't see any value to it and don't want to spend money seeking out such services. Similarly, abused parents, the abusing parent is reluctant to seek services because they don't want to present themselves for examination to show that there is abuse and parental deficiencies on their part. There is a relative credibility of the parents. The rejecting parent distorts reality with fabrications and lies, whereas the targeted parent wants to tell the truth and be known and wants the evaluator to know everything, or the reunification therapist. It's very open, whereas the abuser is likely to lie and deny and minimize the nature of the abuse. So non-abusing parents are more credible and do not use absurd allegations. Then we have the programming of the child's campaign of denigration, where the PAS parent is active and deliberate. They get the story right with no experience and no details, whereas the child often needs a refresher course with the rejecting parent, the alienating parent, whereas the abused child and the parent that witnesses or is concerned about the abuse with the child, they can recall the scenarios quite effectively. The abused child does not want to talk about the abuse, and there's accuracy in the abuse reporting. There's overprotective and exclusive maneuvers on the PAS cases where the alienating parent extends all areas of contact with the targeted parent. It's not specific to the abuse alone. It may be that in situations that the father, let's say, would drink too much and therefore get roughed with the children, that would be a specific situation in which he was at home, somewhat intoxicated, whereas the alienating parent would select any number of situations, not limited to a particular situation which abuse would occur. There's also appreciation by the other parent of the multiple roles of abuser that the abuser may play, so that in certain situations the spouse of the or former spouse of the abuser may say that there is some value in visitation in other situations and advocate for continued contact with the child as long as safety was respected. Whereas the PAS parent would recommend a parentectomy, which is a more popular term in the literature of eliminating that other parent. Let's see. Psychopathic behavior with no guilt for antisocial acts, that sort of speaks for itself. Comparison of family members who are victimized. The abused may be the spouse and the child, and this may have taken place over the years, whereas the targeted parent is often referred to as more current allegations against them, where in the past there weren't these allegations because there's no record or documentation of them. Family history, that often the abusers were abused as children, but rarely do we find that in a PAS history. There's a comparative concern for the physical and financial well-being of the family. Abusers lack a sense of family responsibility, whereas the targeted parent is the committed parent that wants and willing to try most anything to reunite with their alienated children. Impulsivity is often characteristic of abusers, where the targeted parent doesn't necessarily have a problem in this area. The hostile personality pattern and paranoia, that anger fuels the abusers, where with PAS it expands paranoia, suspicion to the targeted parent in all areas, to the point of being preposterous and illegal. I've had situations where the targeted parent's accused of abuse and even sexual molestation in front of the court-ordered supervisors during periods of time of monitoring and litigation. So it doesn't matter what the circumstances are, these people are victims to this kind of abuse and allegations. Now I'll talk about estrangement. That is the next criteria. And the definition, I'll offer a narrow explanation and then a broader one. The narrow explanation is the circumstance of having a child having a realistic or reasonable or rational reason to reject the parent because of abuse, neglect, abandonment, and/or domestic violence. A broader consideration of the term is that the distinction between problematic parent behavior, the actions of a child, the alienation factors, which should be conceived as any reason for the child's rejection of a parent, encompassing all issues that can cause a parent-child conflict other than or excluding alienation. The response of an estranged child is justified and proportionate to the behavior of the parent. And the past or premarital separation relationship is the same as or similar to the divorce one. So what I came up with was a list, which I'll go into, of considerations. And these are situations in which a child's rejection of a parent is based upon a combination of one or more factors of realistic estrangement and the contributing alienating behavior of the other parent, such as in the case of remarriage, or the child is upset with the new step parent, or the other parent negatively influences the child, feeling threatened with parental replacement. Now, this list that has, let's see, 18 items are considerations. This does not mean that in any of these considerations that estrangement will take place. It's just, it's possible that it may take place. And we want to be familiar with these considerations to rule them out, so we can rule in a diagnosis of alienation when in fact that's operating, because it's a real mistake to identify abuse or estrangement when it's alienation and the reverse. Sometimes there are attempts at alienation, making derogatory comments about the other parent that may unintentionally estrange oneself from the children. There's abuse of any number of kinds. Neglect, where disinterest or general abandonment or emotional or physical neglect takes place, which is understandable. And the topic that was referred to earlier, a failure to bond or attach, is developmental. There's a lack of warmth or empathy with the child, so there's no connection there. It could be ineffective parenting or parental deficiencies, including persistent, immature, self-centered behaviors or restrictive parenting styles or punitive parenting. Another consideration is called parental aggravation, which is not a very popular term, but it nevertheless is helpful to understand, as defined as a child as being more difficult to care for than most, and the child engages in behavior that aggravates the parent. The parent sacrifices more of his or her life to meet the child's needs than expected, and the parent resents and exhibits anger towards that child. Now, there may be situations of physical illness of a parent or a child. A parent requires ongoing kidney dialysis, or a child requires specialized cancer care and restricted activities. And either of these circumstances may impact on the relationship, the time, and how one another relates to one another. We're more familiar with the mental illness or personal cluster of characteristics of the child with a parent. Parent may be schizophrenic or suffer from depression or have a passive dependent personality, or the child may have an anxiety or panic disorder and exhibit various kinds of phobic reactions leading to avoidance. Substance abuse of the parent or the child. The parent may be alcoholic, or the adolescent could be a drug addict, such that the child may refuse visitation because the parent is intoxicated and attempts to drink and drive with the child, in which the reference to the rejected parent may feel this is uncalled for and they're being alienated, when in fact it's a real situation in which the child is very uncomfortable with that parent's behavior. It could be an auto accident or injury causing life-changing events or disruptive circumstances, disability or family problems, or even a job relocation to a different country or part of a country in which there's a lack of contact, and in many situations the family closes that gap where that parent played a substantial and important role, no longer is involved with the family, and as a result there's estrangement. If there's prolonged absence due to military deployment, or a parent is sentenced to a jail confinement, may affect early attachment or bonding depending on the age, and also how the other parent handles the situation. If they explain that that parent really is no significant loss and you're better off without that parent, and starts to feed that child various kinds of statements, versus talking about, writing to, having contact with that parent, keeping alive, they prefer the other parent. that is less accessible to the child, so that the child is very much a part of thinking about that parent through pictures or conversations or emails or otherwise. Let's see. The intimate partner, cohabitation, remarriage, or blended family may lead to dissonance or incongruence and a rejection of the parent's new spouse by insistence of acceptance into the family before the child was ready, or there may be hostility among the siblings, which would be another reason for estrangement. Then there's normal adolescent rebellion for the purpose of individuation or separation, a teenager playing one parent against the other, trying to escape the discipline or boundaries in one home, preferring to be with a more permissive, indulgent parent. However, in these situations, the adolescent is willing to admit to their wrongdoing and offer an apology. Enmeshment or parentification, in which the child-parent boundary fusion takes place, where there's a role reversal with an emotionally needy and deficient parent, might be another situation for estrangement. Developmentally, there are expectable reactions that contribute to a child's negative attitudes and behavior, separation anxieties from young children, which Dr. Burnett spoke about, primary attachment, gender identification, older sibling influences, adolescent negativity, and other childhood situations. And lastly, alignments due to high conflict, where the divorce causes negative attitudes and defiant behavior, divided loyalty binds, and children trying to get out of being placed in the middle of the situation, or feeling sympathy for a rejected or divorced parent may side with them. And any of these considerations need to be taken into consideration in identifying whether estrangement or alienation is taking place. And once this passes the test that none of these factors operate, there's no abuse, there's no estrangement, there's clear alienation taking place, then we need to look at what to do about that. And I put together a chart which differentiates psychotherapy and reunification therapy. And anyone that would like copies of any of these slides, I'll be happy to take your email address, or you could email me and I could forward these to you. Because this chart's a lot to digest, but it differentiates between psychotherapy and reunification, which is very different. And unfortunately, we don't really have training programs in reunification therapy. The MFT programs in marriage and family therapy do not even include, and very rarely even reference, reunification therapy. The categories, just to go through some of them as examples of who is the client. Certainly in psychotherapy, it's the mental health practitioner whose client is the patient, whereas in reunification, it's the attorneys, the jurisdiction of the court, and often occurs through a court appointment. In terms of privilege, you have therapist-patient privilege, where in reunification, informed consent or a court order defines full disclosure of what's going on. So that's alone is a very significant variable. Finances, when you go to a psychotherapist, it's managed care or self-pay or insurance reimbursement, where it's predetermined by the attorneys in the court which percentage or who pays the financial expense, which is unlikely to be reimbursed by any insurance coverage, as Dr. Darnell explained to us earlier. Who pays does not determine the process nor the outcome. There's various roles that play in psychotherapy versus reunification. In reunification, it's a more limited, restricted, and well-defined role. And the reunification therapist must refer to another therapist or back to the court for an appointment to psychotherapy if we identify in the reunification process that one or more of the individuals has a emotional problem, substance abuse, or one of those mental diagnoses. In terms of goals, the goals are defined in psychotherapy between the therapist and the patient, whereas in reunification, the client, the attorney, and the court define what the objectives are, and they're clearly spelled out. There are different preferences and goals for each of the children and the parents. This is why I use the term with reunification, you need a plan. You just can't have a referral and you start doing reunification without fully understanding the history and the variables that preceded your role and having some definition by the court. Because what happens in these situations is typically if you make progress in reunification, the alienating parent will be certain to disrupt that process. They will indicate that it's inconvenient, they don't want to pay for it, they'll shop for another therapist, the child will feel uncomfortable with the therapist, or what may occur that happens in regular therapy is that the therapist is taken in by the charm and persuasiveness of the alienating parent, and that the child gives fairly convincing stories, so that the therapist may well side with the alienating parent and feel, well, the child is telling the truth, and look at the targeted parent in a disappointing way and feel often repulsed by that targeted parent as if they were in fact responsible or guilty for the allegations asserted toward them. So there is a need for a plan. Now we talk about the process variables. Maybe I can talk about how a plan comes about. In severe cases of alienation, unless you have some court mandate, it's difficult to provide evidence that there is severe alienation. So at best what the reunification therapist can do is document, lots of documentation, and bring these concerns to the court. Whereas ideally, what would be most helpful is that there has been a prior custody evaluation or some sort of evaluation that's taken place to identify that we're dealing with alienation, so you can have a well-developed plan that the evaluator hands the plan to the reunification therapist who then implements it. So often the case of the individual that develops a reunification plan is the role of the evaluator, not the reunification therapist, because there's an irreconcilable difference between therapy and evaluation. But once the reunification plan is well developed and the court supports it with orders, then the reunification therapist has a reasonable chance of effectiveness in implementing the plan. and can stick by the plan. Now, in terms of process variables, psychotherapy, of course, is alleviation of various symptoms and specific behaviors, overcoming depression or relapse prevention with substance abuse, whereas in reunification therapy, you're overcoming visitation refusal, phobic reactions to reconciliation with the targeted parent. The term is more phobic because it's not a real situation based on a fear, but rather some imaginary concern that's been promulgated by the rejecting favorite parent. And it's most important to maintain the boundaries that are defined in terms of the process variables, both in content and role. One of the things that's different with reunification therapy in mild or in moderate cases versus severe is that mild and moderate, you would like both parents to participate as well as working with the children. However, picture what happens when you try to engage in reunification therapy with a malicious, alienating parent whose intention is to disrupt and destroy any semblance of reunification. And Dr. Darnell used the term this parent is obsessed with every opportunity to exploit the situation, to sabotage and end and destroy that relationship. So does it make sense to bring in the alienating parent into a reunification effort? Does it make sense to offer that parent an opportunity to present a list of who would be qualified as reunification therapists? When it's mild and moderate, it's helpful to have both parents participate and select an individual. When it becomes severe, the choice is with the targeted parent. It's explained in the court and in the reunification plan that the reunification needs to take place with the targeted parent and the alienated child without the interference of the alienating parent, who is not subject to change either in reunification therapy nor is unlikely in individual psychotherapy. Now, often the courts, in their ultimate wisdom, will at least try and say that the alienating parent needs to go to therapy and understand what they're doing to their children, the harm they're inflicting. But as we know from our experience, this is really has little value, and that alienating parent often turns the therapist into not an objective person to provide feedback and guidance, but instead an advocate for their position as they talk about how terrible the targeted parent is and the damage that they've caused the children, so that the therapist then starts to believe that position. Now, what would happen in a situation with individual therapy or family therapy in which the therapist did not side with the rejecting, alienating parent? They'd cease the therapy. Why would an alienating parent engage on a weekly basis with a therapist that's not going to support their position? They'll find some excuse to exit from that or shop for another therapist. What will happen, however, is that the therapist economically will say, if I don't participate and support this individual, I won't have a patient. They're not going to continue. So there is some economic incentive for the therapist to go along with the alienating parent's charm. The other consideration is cognitive dissonance, which was referred to earlier today, but it also plays a part with the therapist. A therapist it has some difficulty trying to sort out between the target parent and the alienating parent, and is the child telling the truth and what's going on. And the comfort level is to go with the flow and support the child and the child's statements and allegations and the convincing, compelling arguments used by the either narcissistic, sociopathic, or borderline, or any combination thereof, alienating parent, which often makes it more comfortable in an alliance established between the therapist and the alienator. So in extreme cases, one wants to exclude the alienating parent because there's no benefit. All they're going to do is disrupt the therapy. You're not going to convince them otherwise. But how do you explain this to the court if you're handed the case without adequate preparation? And this is the way in which a reunification plan would include that, indicating that the targeted parent would select a reunification therapist in which they would be most comfortable, in which they feel that the child would feel comfortable as well, in which they would participate, and at some later date to bring, either through supervised or no contact with the alienating parent. Because what happens is, let's say this therapy session is one time a week, so you have 1 hour of great reunification therapy against every day in duration of the alienation and programming and indoctrination of the preferred parent. It's no contest. So unless the reunification plan included some way to minimize the destruction or disruptiveness of the rejecting parent, how effective can we think that the reunification process might be? This is where we need court sanctions, court orders, and court sanctions meaning that if the alienating parent calls the targeted parent or the child during their visitation with them, that's very disruptive. So that these things are forbidden and not allowed. Selection of a mental health professional, as I indicated, in mild and moderate cases, there'd be joint selection, whereas in severe cases, that would be up to the targeted parent. The theoretical foundation, which would be in traditional psychotherapy, the therapist's choice according to the presenting problem, whereas the reunification, look at family systems theory, the identified patient being part of the family system, and there's various kinds of techniques you can use within that, which includes cognitive behavioral and desensitization kinds of techniques, again, that hopefully will be more effective than having an alienating parent in the waiting room and interfering with that relationship that you hope to reunify. The participants with traditional therapy, you have the patient, may bring in collateral individuals, which may take place in mild or moderate cases where you have both parents participating, but again, the participant in the reunification with extreme cases or severe cases is the high-risk child and the alienated parent, the targeted parent. The rules or process guidelines is to follow what's outlined by the court, and hopefully, if you don't have a plan, to ask for a plan. Otherwise, trying to wing it will be ineffective. Whereas in psychotherapy, the patient and the therapist develop their own guidelines and plans. And you can expect various resistance from the attorney representing the favored parent. And the court often does not like to deal with these kinds of cases and would like an easier solution, just refer it to the therapist and let the therapist work out these problems and not get involved in defining the particulars of how the reunification process should be implemented. We have the cognitive set and evaluative attitude of each mental health professional, in which the situation with psychotherapy, one's supportive and empathetic and very accepting, versus reunification therapy, one is direct, neutral, detached, goal-driven, without deviation. So it's a very highly structured approach versus what may be a less structured kind of approach. And for many of us, this will be a comforting and area that we wish to pursue, and others of which may wish to avoid reunification therapy because it is different than psychotherapy. The nature and degree of the alliance with each relationship, often referred to as advocacy in psychotherapy, where in reunification, it's detailed documentation, there's external pressures for compliance and court sanctions, and there's punitive measures for non-compliance. Okay, almost finished. The training, of course, would be different than traditional psychotherapy, and it's helpful to have a background doing forensic work, evaluation, working with divorce, parent coordination, family therapy, and the diagnostic criteria for hypothesis testing is different for psychotherapy versus a psycholegal criteria for the purpose of reconciliation with the courts. Let's see. The amount and control of the relationship I've already dealt with. The scrutiny in the private office of a psychotherapist, it has its set of privacy where a fishbowl exists when it's reunification therapy. Everything's documented, no confidentiality exists, and reports have to go back to the court, and resistance and where problems occurred. And the last, the goal of the therapy, where the therapist defines the treatment goals with the patient's participation, as opposed to the reunification therapist addresses the goals as defined by the court, with reporting as to progress in achieving stated objectives. So that's an overview that differentiates therapy and reunification therapy, in which those distinctions are typically blurred, and often a case is referred and the judge calls it reunification therapy, and as a therapist we don't really appreciate that it's a very different process. The criteria for success with psychotherapy is patient satisfaction, amelioration of symptoms, whereas the effectiveness may be based on reunification in terms of what degree of visitation took place and change of emotional expression and attachment of the child.